Hello, this is Jeffrey, and I'm doing a book review of The Untethered Soul by Michael A. Singer. So this book's main premise talks about this idea of mainly following and finding yourself, which is your consciousness and your real interpretation of the world. Right now, Michael A. Singer argues that most people's interpretation of the consciousness is the scene and everything and the thoughts and the behavior that they view in daily life. But Michael A. Singer argues that instead, our consciousness can actually take a step behind and see all this unfold in front of us. And that is the proper way to kind of approach the world. It's like the analogy that he puts over is like watching a movie. In reality, our life is just a movie with all our senses involved. But if we take a step back and realize that we, the observer, are just watching a movie unfold, we can have a better interpretation of all the events that happen in our lives. It gives us better control over the pain, the bad things that can happen, and it gives us the choice to ultimately choose to be happy and enjoy our lives. That's what mainly the premise of the book is about. He argues that through different ideas, including like breaking down these walls of the consciousness, in order to feel the happiness and the light beyond the boundaries, and other things about like unconditional happiness, the idea of contemplating death, in the sense that death is actually a blessing, and other things along those. As for me, I think this book has a lot of interesting philosophies that definitely change the way I kind of approach myself and life, that I think are tremendously valuable. I personally favor books that have a little more kind of logical backing in where they explain kind of the phenomenons a little more. But I think Michael A. Singer's book is not really that kind of book, in where it doesn't really explain why our consciousness is different than the emotions we see and everything about that, but it kind of just says he kind of writes it in more of a meditative kind of writing, in the sense that he's guiding you through this idea, and he wants you to try to imagine yourself and follow through with it. So it's not really kind of understanding the science behind it, but it's more about following this meditation. And that's good in itself, but if you want a little more backing and evidence behind what is actually happening to make sure you actually know what's happening, like a logical kind of thinking, it might not be the best book. But I think there's tremendously valuable ideas in here, and there's definitely, I think, a good book to read. Sometimes the ideas may seem a little repetitive, but ultimately there are subtle changes in kind of the ideas. Like, you can think about the voice inside your head, right? It's kind of one of the subchapters, your inner roommate, where it's kind of talking about how you are not the thoughts that you were thinking. But it also talks about later in the book, talking about removing your inner thorn, which is like pains that you feel inside yourself, that are affecting your lives and how you ignore them. And these are kind of similar topics, but they're still subtly different. But sometimes it makes you feel like you're reading repetitive ideas. So that's my review of the book. I'm going to get into a chapter-by-chapter analysis and summary. So the first thing is that first part we're going to look at is the part 1, Awakening Consciousness. And it has the subchapters, the voice inside your head, your inner roommate, who are you in the lucid self. And here Michael A. Singer talks about this idea. He introduces the idea that we are not the thoughts that we think. If someone bumps us on the shoulder in the middle of the street, and we think to ourselves, oh, that guy's so annoying, he's so mean, oh, what is that? And then like 3 seconds later, we start commenting about something else. We have this thought that constantly goes inside our head, just speaking to us. And Michael Singer is trying to tell us that is not ourselves. He relates it to the analogy of having an inner roommate inside your brain who is someone else. It's a different entity, it's a different person who is just speaking all that stuff to you. And he's trying to make us realize that we, as the conscious observer, are not the thoughts that we think. We can go about life just realizing that those are not our thoughts, and we can take them in an objective sense, and that's kind of what he's trying to introduce to ourselves. And he also relates to the idea of lucid dreaming, understanding that you are watching your life unfold, not the life is happening to you. And that gives you kind of a backing to your idea of the world, and where you realize that you are in control, but at the same time that you have kind of more bird's eye view of your own life. It kind of is kind of a hard concept to describe, but it's kind of like that. So that's the first part. Second part is this idea of energy. So the first part talked about how we have inner thoughts. The second part talks about how we can discover the energy that is within us. So it's pretty different. And it's the idea of kind of what he says is that there are a bunch of there is potential for unlimited energy in our cells. And it mainly comes from the idea that we are able to have infinite energy if we choose to do so. And he relates that to the idea of never closing the heart. And he says that whenever we go through anything bad happens to us, we close our hearts. When we get in a breakup, our hearts close and we are lazy all day. But when something good happens to us, like we win the lottery, our hearts open up and we are so motivated to do everything about the day. And Michael Singer here says such a simple idea. And it's that just if you want to have unlimited energy and be an open spirit, never close. It's that simple. And that kind of doesn't make sense to me when I first read it, but I realized slowly later on that it really is that simple. If you want to live life with a lot of energy, you just have to always think to yourself, something happens to you that's negative. You're going to be like, okay, that's negative, but you allow it to flow through you and never close that kind of energy source that is your heart, and which is Michael Singer saying. And from there, you can have a lot of energy. So that's kind of what the second part talks about. I think that was a very interesting concept. So is the first part about talking about the self. These are two concepts that are shown to me that I never thought about before, so they're incredibly insightful. So next part we have freeing yourself. And this is kind of, I say, similar to the first part, and we're talking about this idea of you have this, or it's really similar to the second part, I would say, actually, in where there is going to be things that happen to you, your insecurities, your fears, and where you're going to have to deal with them in order to live a better life. It's kind of the idea of how to get the open heart. And so he's saying if anything happens to you, especially insecurities that can be formed from small moments in your past, which are held and kept within your body, if you ever have those moments happen to you and those moments explode inside within you, and if you are able to figure out a way, or if you are able to resist the change to close, and you are able to let that kind of memory come within you, hurt you for a little bit, and eventually come out, it's going to be ultimately much better than taking that pain from inside you, looking into it, and making yourself feel bad. An example is like, in the past, if you had a traumatic moment with falling off the ladder, and another time you're going rock climbing and you realize, oh, I'm so scared, that pain can go inside you, and you can either, two choices, you can either, one, look into that pain, right? Put your attention towards that pain, and let the attention exponentiate into a full out, just only think about that moment, and eventually that make the pain your entire just body and closes everything down and makes everything feel really bad. Or you can realize, okay, that pain's coming up. The best thing I can do is just let it go and get on with my life. And that's kind of the idea of let go now or fall, which is a subchapter in here, and removing the inner thorn, kind of the same ideas. And he kind of says this thing about how humans are always suffering. This is kind of what the Buddhists say within their own religion, but it's this idea that he believes that we're always suffering because of the constant pain we're inflicting on ourselves within our thoughts, our insecurities, and all these things we're always worrying about on a small-term basis. And Michael Singer says that's why the Buddha thinks we're suffering. And enlightenment, in which he says is ultimately the form of finding an out of the suffering, in which he relates to a house analogy, which is part 4, and taking down the walls, in the sense that our conceptions, thoughts of everything around ourselves, our ideas of everything, builds a circle that blocks all the light from outside of us to us. And eventually that makes it so that if we don't light within the circle, we're not going to have any light in our lives. But that's ultimately artificial, in the sense that we are trying to create something to make ourselves feel good, which are just a conception of our thoughts and ideas, right? If we didn't have thoughts and ideas in the first place, we would have light and ready, right? If you're not insecure, if you had no pain, the light already comes to you. And that's kind of the idea of being able to push past those behaviors and thoughts. You are able to reach the sense of enlightenment in where you do not need to build your own happiness, and the happiness already comes to you. And this comes to the last part of the book, where he talks about how you're going to live life. And one of those core ideas is unconditional happiness. Happiness is a choice, and where you can choose to be happy or not. Regardless of the events that happen in your life, you can have the ultimate authority of whether or not you'll be happy or not. This is kind of similar to this idea popular in other books called Stoicism, where you are just the person who can reflect on what is happening on you, and you can change the way you interpret them. What happens to you is inevitable, but you can change the way you think about them and approach them. And it's kind of the same idea that unconditional happiness, whatever happens to you, you can still be happy. Even with death, even the worst things in the world, you can still be happy. And he also says some other concepts that are not really related to the rest of the book here, but they're still incredibly valuable and insightful, and things such as the spiritual path of non-resistance, which is kind of letting life flow through you and not really trying to ever put up a fight against it. You are not able to change life in any form or shape. You can only let life come as it is. And it's kind of this idea of what Lao Tzu said about in the kind of Taoism, and where life is going to happen to you. It's inevitable. It's been happening for years and years, and you are only able to adapt to it and see how it goes and take the flow of the river, And that's kind of what he's saying here, of just putting non-resistance, going with the most optimal path, in the sense of not forcing anything, not trying to change your life to force an idea, an imagination, fantasy, because that's not going to happen. A big thing that he talks about here that kind of is the last big philosophy point that I think was really, really insightful was this idea of contemplating death. How do we approach death? And in popular ideas, we view death as this thing that's horrible, and we also ultimately neglect it most of the times. And Michael Singer here is saying that death is ultimately actually incredibly a blessing. It makes our lives full of meaning. It makes our lives have limitness, which allows us to actually live life in the present. But most people don't do that, as he says. He says that most people treat life as it's infinite because they neglect it, right? They live life as if they have another one to live. They do things they don't like. They're living like they're holding themselves back. But as soon as you bring up this idea that what if you had 1 week of life to live and death would come, then you would live life in such a different manner. And in this sense, Michael Singer trying to remind you that death is so good to actually imagine. Imagine that you would die whenever. You have no choice of your death. Death is imminent in every second. In every single possible action a human has ever done, there has been a death correlated with it. And he says that kind of the idea that you should imagine that death may be present at any moment, and at that same time, you will gain a blessing of living life to the fullest. You'll realize that you were born on this planet to enjoy and grow, and just neglecting that idea and neglecting death ultimately make your life completely meaningless. So he's kind of trying to say is that death is ultimately important for you to realize, and that, do what you really enjoy. That's the whole point. We were not born on this earth to suffer. We're not born on this planet to worry about insecurity, all these little small things. We were born to have bliss, to enjoy what we were doing, to enjoy our existence, to enjoy the fact that we are life, and like that. It's just that simple. He talks about some other concepts, such as this idea of following the middle way, which means just never going any extreme, and you can be ultimately balanced and never tired out. You don't have to zigzag, which is just going through extreme, rather you can just go in the moderate level. I didn't really kind of use that as an interpretation for my own life yet, so that was not that impactful for me. And the loving eyes of God. This is very interesting. This is another interesting concept in the sense that God or religion is not found by convincing yourself that it is there. Rather, it's found by following the meditations and realize that you get yourself to such a high point and where you see everyone with love because there is no conception in your brain that says otherwise. Right now, we may think that people are set stereotypes. We only like some stereotypes. We only like some people. But ultimately, when you come to the meditations that Michael Singer describes, and you go past all of those, you realize that everybody is just the same, and you love everyone because you have to enjoy everything. Death is imminent. What's the point of hating when you can love? And Michael Singer argues that at that point, you realize kind of exactly what the eyes of God look like, and that kind of transcends you to this idea that God is real and God is there. And let me just read the last quote of this book for you, which kind of talks about this idea, is that as you drift back, this is kind of 3 paragraphs, but I'll read it out. So your relationship with God is the same as your relationship with the sun. If you hide from the sun for years and then choose to come out of the darkness, the sun would still be shining as if you had never left. You don't need to apologize, you just pick your head up and look at the sun. It's the same way when you decide to turn towards God. You just do it. If instead you allow guilt and shame to interfere, that's just your ego blocking the divine force. You can't defend the divine one. Its very nature is light, love, compassion, protection, and giving. You can't make it stop loving you, just like the sun. You can't make the sun stop shining on you. You can only choose not to look at it. The moment you look, you'll see it's there. As you drift back into spirit, you will see that those are the eyes that look out upon this world. That is the heart that shines down upon everything and everyone. Through those eyes, the most wretched of creation looks beautiful. That's the part that no one understands. People say that God cries when he looks at the earth. The saint sees that God goes into ecstasy when he looks upon this earth. Under all conditions and at all times, ecstasy is the only thing God knows. God's nature is eternal, conscious bliss. No matter what you've done, you're not going to be the one that ruins it. The beauty is that you can experience this ecstasy, and when you begin to feel this joy, that's when you'll know God's nature. And then nobody will upset or disappoint you. Nothing will create a problem. It will all appear as part of a beautiful dance of creation unfolding before you. Your natural state will get higher and higher. You'll feel love instead of shame. Instead of being unwilling to lift your eyes to the divine because of what you said or done, you'll see the divine as a place of unconditional refuge. Contemplate this and let go of the idea of a judgmental God. You have a loving God in truth. You have a love in self for a God, and love cannot do other than love. Your God is in ecstasy, and there's nothing you can do about it. And if God is in ecstasy, I wonder what he sees when he looks at you. And so it's kind of the idea that he wraps up the book with that we can vision what God is seeing, and that makes us ultimately kind of believe in God in a sense. So like I said, this book is incredibly insightful. It shows a lot of these philosophies and meditations about how to approach life, which I think are very interesting. But after reading this book, it's kind of a snippet into the world of kind of this meditative thinking. I really want to read more about kind of where the comings of it are from, and what more of these ideas and more stories of how like people actually transform towards these paths. And I think that's incredibly interesting. It's also an incredibly vital book to read, to feel like you're actually being transcended. I kind of feel like I was in like a rainforest for some time reading this book. So ultimately, I would recommend it. And that was my summary analysis and review. Thank you for watching.